Before we dive into lists, details, facts, and opinions, I want to make it clear that this isn't going to be some kind of gotcha video where I reveal some dark secrets about Cities Skylines II that all of us early access creators have been keeping from you. What you've seen and will continue to see up until release and beyond is very much what you will get with Cities Skylines II, and both Colossal Order and Paradox Interactive have been fairly honest and upfront about the realities of the game, including recent announcements about changes to modding as well as a lack of an asset editor on day one. My goal is simply to paint a picture of my thoughts and feelings on Cities Skylines II as both someone that's played Cities Skylines I since before it launched and had the opportunity to not only spend the last couple of months with the sequel, but also spend a couple of days playing it back in 2021. The main thing I will say, without directly quoting or showing private conversations, is that the people at both Colossal Order and Paradox Interactive have been super open to having frank conversations about the game, and they've listened to what we've all liked and disliked during the past couple of months of early access, and they have been working around the clock to implement fixes to bugs that we find and to tweak systems that we end up thinking need a bit of work. There's a super passionate bunch of people behind Cities Skylines II, and so even if the game isn't exactly what you want it to be right now, I have every bit of faith that Colossal Order will make this game into something just as special as the first, which we have to remember had 8 years worth of bug fixes, patches, and expansions. Probably the strongest and most stubborn stance that I'm going to take on Cities Skylines II is that I totally believe this game is visually stunning. I've seen some discourse here and there the past couple of months that it's boring, which I think is true as far as many of the lower density rooftops being fairly flat and gray happens to be, but overall, as a whole package, this game is absolutely beautiful. And it's carried heavily by some incredible lighting simulations, including dynamic volumetric clouds which cast shadows over your city and have stunning light rays through them and around them at times as well. Now, I'll admit, a lot of what the lighting does for this game is only ever going to be on show if you keep the day-night cycle visuals enabled, which I typically don't, and I don't think I actually know anyone that does keep those switched on. Worth keeping in mind, though, is that when this visual option is switched off, the sun is locked to be almost directly above your city, providing the most even lighting across everything that it possibly can, which is completely deliberate, but it does make things look really flat and a whole lot flatter than they otherwise would with something like a moving source of light. Sunset and sunrise in Cities Skylines II happen to be incredible times of day to experience, and more than a few times I found myself flying around with a cinematic camera trying to capture those golden hour moments. We spent some of the last few weeks diving into all of the feature highlight and developer insight videos, talking all about roads and traffic AI in Cities Skylines II. Probably to the point that I managed to shoehorn it into videos that had nothing to do with either of those things. And while at times it does seem like there's less traffic overall on the roads in Cities Skylines II, I can't help but wonder if that's because perhaps traffic in general is just much better at pathfinding this time around, and so the huge clusters of traffic that you would see in that first game, or at least that I would see in my cities, just don't happen as much. That's not to say that the traffic AI in the sequel is a miracle worker, because bad road layouts will still absolutely lead to traffic jams upon traffic jams. I just think it's a great feeling to have traffic AI that just seems to make sense. Now, speaking of the roads themselves, I absolutely love and adore how much more fluid they are, and I don't mean that as some generic industry buzzword. I mean, literally. The days are gone where you would see weird and sharp connections and angles on highways, well, without mods anyway. And today's the day of smooth connections, dedicated turning lanes, lane-by-lane connections in some cases, and a whole lot more. While I do absolutely miss the units of measurement for roads in the first game, the sheer amount of control that you have over roads in Cities Skylines II is almost staggering. And during this early access period for creators, I have seen some layouts and interchanges that were once only ever possible with not just one but several mods in that first game. That's not to say that something like a hypothetical Traffic Manager 2 wouldn't be welcome, but it doesn't feel as necessary this time around. Although, to play devil's advocate to my own point, I can't help but wonder if I'll feel the same way about it if or when that day comes. Although I suppose time will tell. In Cities Skylines 2, everything is bigger, from larger maps to larger buildings, and that includes a larger sense of impending doom spurred on by the knowledge that regardless of how many thousands of hours you spend on traffic infrastructure, you're never going to be as good as— This sense of scale isn't misused or wasted either. With a change to a more realistic setup for building occupancy, you're going to find yourself needing more suburban space this time around, as those single-family homes are ideal for, surprisingly, families. Let's not forget either that things like power plants, incineration plants, cemeteries, and hospitals take up much more space in Cities Skylines 2. So the extra scale on the maps will be something that you actually feel yourself putting to good use this time around. That sense of scale actually goes hand in hand with the first point that I talked about, road infrastructure and traffic AI, as having ease of access to those services often means that you can take a less is more approach to those things, wherein you're not required to place a medical clinic for every single district, and you can instead simply rely on a central clinic or hospital to service a much wider space if that's something you want to do. This can, as we know, also be helped along by a solid public transport network as well. In all honesty, I've yet to fully experiment with the sense of scale in Cities Skylines 2. That is something I have wanted to explore through gameplay videos here on the channel so that I can capture my genuine in-the-moment reaction when I inevitably zoom out and have a moment where I see just how much I've built across these huge maps and how excellently, or more likely poorly, everything seems to be running. That said, I've had a couple of sandbox cities here and there these past couple of months, and without giving too much away, it's a really great feeling to see everything coming together across a larger map. It's also great to see that there's not quite the same need for skyscrapers in the sequel. As I mentioned before, buildings are scaled more realistically in terms of their occupancy. So where a tower may once have held 30 to 40 families in the first game, this time they can hold over 200 families. This can, as the title of the game suggests, lead to some great city skylines. In all honesty, there's a chance that part of what I love about the progression available in Cities Skylines 2 is that it just feels so different to what we came to know in the first game naturally over the course of almost 9 years. Simply relying on the population of your city to unlock different milestones made the gameplay loop in Cities Skylines fairly repetitive, and that's not to say I had any issue with it. And so having a system in the sequel that takes into account not only population, but the happiness of the population, or the expansion of your road network, or the increase in overall service coverage, or even the construction of new service buildings themselves, all to provide experience points, all of which tally up to get you to the next milestone level, well, it's really refreshing. It opens the door for different styles of gameplay that are just as valid as many others, and they'll still work just fine in terms of getting you from a village to a town to a city. I also really appreciate that each milestone isn't, funnily enough, set in stone this time around. Being granted development points to choose what you want to unlock is a really nice touch, as it means that you can lean even harder into your chosen playstyle rather than having to deal with whatever's thrown at you, like you would in Cities Skylines 1. Once again, though, I'm by no means saying that Cities Skylines had bad progression or was a bad game. It wasn't. It toppled a franchise, SimCity, that for many thought was the only big city builder that we'd ever see, even if SimCity helped itself out to pasture a little bit with its 2013 entry. Let's also keep in mind that many, myself included, have been playing this game regularly since 2015, so I'm not by any means saying it was bad. The main takeaway that I have for progression in Cities Skylines 2 is that it's very much up to the player to decide how they wish to progress and in what direction. You can go all in with population, road infrastructure, or whatever you want. Strike a balance between industrial production and exports, go all in on education, or try to be a jack of all trades and do everything. More freedom to the players is only a good thing, and Cities Skylines 2 has that in spades. The minimum required specs for Cities Skylines 2 include suggesting an Intel Core i7-6700K or AMD Ryzen 5 2600X CPU, and an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 970 or AMD Radeon RX 480 graphics card. In 2023, that's not the worst that I've seen for minimum specs on a game, but if we have a look at the recommended specs, things get really interesting. Cities Skylines 2 recommends an Intel Core i5-12600K or AMD Ryzen 7 5800X CPU and an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3080 or AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT graphics card. That's a lot of numbers. It's a lot of letters. Basically, the recommended specs for Cities Skylines 2 are interesting, to say the least. Just so we're clear, even after the increase in the recommended specs following recent updates, Cyberpunk 2077 only recommends a GeForce RTX 2060 Super, which holds a recommended retail price of almost $400 or £315, which is a whole generation of graphics cards behind the 3080 recommended for Cities Skylines 2, which, again, so we're clear, holds a recommended retail price of $699 or £649. We're talking a difference here of $300 between GPU hardware for a city builder. Now, while I absolutely adore the visuals in Cities Skylines 2, it does not, in any universe, hold a candle to what CD Projekt have done with ray tracing and pathfinding in Cyberpunk 2077, yet that is the difference that we're looking at. In terms of CPUs, Cyberpunk recommends a Core i7-12700 versus the Core i5-12600K that's recommended for Cities Skylines 2, which is a difference of about £60 or $70 on Amazon UK at the time of recording, with the Cyberpunk specs being the more expensive set this time around. Something I think many came to appreciate about Cities Skylines was that it was fairly accessible and ran decently on a wide range of hardware. The sequel, unfortunately, just doesn't feel as accessible, and I worry that it's going to feel like a total slog to those with weaker machines who can't afford the $300 or more that they're going to need to match either set of specs for the game. This, I think, is going to be the biggest hurdle in the way of Cities Skylines 2 reaching the same heights as its predecessor. In saying all of this, Colossal Order did get out ahead of these worries and have admitted via recent forum posts and dev diaries that performance isn't where they want it to be. If we think back towards the start of the video, I talked about how open they've been with us early access creators, and also how ready and willing they are to listen to comments and concerns. With many developers, with different franchises and different companies, I'm typically skeptical about how much work is actually going to be done to address issues with their games. With Colossal Order, I've seen firsthand so far just how keen they are to make this game into the next generation city builder. So I suspect and I have faith that with time, performance will improve and continue to improve, which means accessibility is also hopefully going to improve. Okay, so I'm not really going to be a doomer about the whole Paradox Mods versus Steam Workshop thing. My personal preference is to keep things on the platform that I've used for over 8 years and become used to using and that I'm familiar with, but I'm not against trying out a new platform, so long as it works. I believe it was said somewhere on Discord that the version of the Paradox Mods platform that will be used for Cities Skylines 2 will be a step up from, and I would hope an improvement, from versions of the platform that have been used for other games. In total honesty, I've got no idea what Paradox Mods is or how it works. I've never used it. I also really appreciate modding parity between PC and console, as it gives more players more options with their cities. This, however, without any modifications to the code of the game on console, as those tend to be incredibly protective environments versus the Wild West on PC. What this means is that while you can go and download something like a new police station on console, you won't be able to download and use something like Move It. The reason the change to Paradox mods worries me, honestly, is simply that I can't help but feel that the modding scene is a major factor in what's kept Cities Skylines as popular on PC as it has been. If Paradox mods is just as accessible as the Steam Workshop, then once again, this is a non-issue. The only barrier at that point might be logging into a different platform once in a while. If it's not as accessible and it's not as user-friendly as the Steam Workshop, which in itself isn't really that user-friendly, it's good, but it's a bit of a clunky mess sometimes, I have to wonder if a move to using that platform again, using the Steam Workshop, would then be on the cards. Essentially, if Paradox mods doesn't work out, will they backpedal? I don't wish any ill against the new platform or the success of the game, of course I don't, but we've seen major pushback these last few years about the need for so many different launchers and platforms from all of these companies, and they always seem to need or want their own platforms, only to then go crawling back to Steam a few years later. For a long time, we saw this with Activision when they'd only put their games on Battle.net on PC, and for a long time, the majority of Microsoft-published games were only available on one of their variety of storefronts as well. Most of those games are now available, again, on Steam. This isn't to say that the choice to use Paradox mods is bad or on the same level as other publishers trying to launch their own platforms. I just hope the platform is given the same level of love and attention as the game itself, where those creating and running it are as equally keen to listen to user feedback and to make changes for the benefit of accessibility. Something I really appreciated about Cities Skylines was being able to zoom in and see a lot of what was going on in my city. From watching the animations on soccer field to watching firefighters tackling a blaze, or even seeing a coffin being brought out from a residence after someone unfortunately kicks the bucket. It was those little things that made a city feel all that much more alive. And so it's unfortunate then that Cities Skylines 2 doesn't seem to feature any of those things. Soccer fields will stay empty, firefighters stay in their trucks, and it all comes together to make things feel a bit more lifeless than perhaps it should, especially when you consider just how much more alive your Sims actually are with their individual wants, needs, and schedules. It's also a bit disappointing that things like fences and props won't be available as the game launches, so not only are those little detailed animations going to be missing from your streets, but so are those physical little details that you might want to add, such as benches and tables in some green space or an industrial fence surrounding the areas around your industrial buildings. Obviously, it's entirely possible, and I would dare say likely, that we'll see all of those things added to Cities Skylines 2 in the future. I just find myself missing them a whole lot already, which I didn't really think that I would, especially given my tendency to almost criticize the first game for being too much of a city painter versus builder and management game. I guess my point is that those things would be nice, and that it's perhaps more of a nitpick that they're not here than a major complaint. The last thing I want to do is come across as a bit of a hypocrite. I don't want this to come across as a no-win situation for Colossal Order, where they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. They make a city painter and I'm complaining. They actually make a management game and I'm still complaining. That's not what I'm getting at. I just miss having those little details. So in conclusion, I absolutely love Cities Skylines 2, and I'm excited to see what comes next for the game. That said, there are some imperfections that with time can probably be worked through and Colossal Order can probably overcome. Cities Skylines 2 is not a perfect game, and I suspect and hope that in the coming weeks and months we're gonna see many of the things we're still longing for and missing added to that game, or at least addressed in a forum post or announcements. I think it's also important to be realistic with Cities Skylines 2. The first game had 8 years of patches and content following launch. At the time of recording, Cities Skylines 2 isn't even out yet. Does that excuse everything? Not necessarily, but I suppose it's most comparable to a Sims release. Many of the things from the previous game have certainly been improved upon, But we all know that we're counting down the days until the Pets expansion comes out. Another narrative that I've seen come up recently is the idea that Cities Skylines II is yet another example of an unfinished game being released, with the knowledge that consumers will likely purchase it anyway, either out of brand loyalty or fear of missing out, or because they don't know any better. This isn't so much a Colossal Order or Paradox Interactive thing so much as it's an industry-wide problem and has been for many years, although I think if we're honest with ourselves, things have gotten a bit better lately. Baldur's Gate is an amazing example of an early access to release done perfectly, with Ubisoft also not releasing Skull and Bones until it's apparently done, or their Singapore money dries up. And even games like Dead Island 2 that could have been crapped out years ago, but weren't, and released earlier this year in fantastic shape and wound up being way better than I think anyone expected it to be. Could Cities Skylines 2 benefit from a delay for some extra polish and optimization? Yeah, probably. Does it urgently, definitively need those things? I don't think it does. In my past few months with the game, it's been a lot of fun and I've enjoyed almost every second of it. But obviously, and this is important to keep in mind with any videos that you're seeing on Cities Skylines 2 from any creators, I do have a lot of brand loyalty here. I have worked with Paradox Interactive on many sponsored projects over the years. I've been flown to Germany for Gamescom. I've been to Stockholm to film with them. I've visited their offices, and I've always been provided keys to almost all of their games, including Cities Skylines, the expansions, and the sequel, both for free and well ahead of time. My opinion on what's tolerable and intolerable here might vary differently from yours, and it's important to keep that in mind when it comes to any game, not just this one, especially when it's coming from creators like myself, who largely make a living off of this franchise. With that said, being able to release gameplay over the past month and having a week of pre-release videos going out without restrictions should hopefully give you plenty of options, opinions, and opportunities to watch gameplay and make up your own mind about whether Cities Skylines 2 is for you right now, or something you're willing to wait a little bit to pick up, or something that you're just simply not interested in. Whatever your choice happens to me, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.